Alrighty, everybody, welcome to this week's lecture. We're going to be going over Minoan and Greek art this week, but also sort of discuss Roman art a little bit later on Wednesday. The Bronze Age, which took place around 3000 to 1000 BCE, was a period when cultures were either using, producing, or trading bronze. Several cultures flourished around the Aegean Sea during this period. And specifically, you can kind of see in the sort of central part where the Aegean Sea sits now, we have the Cyclades, we have the Minoans, and the Mycenaean. These three cultures developed independently and at different times during being in contact with each other, as well as with other regions, including Egypt and Mesopotamia. Part about what I want everybody to sort of recognize, but also sort of see, is how in which we can understand the Western civilization's developments of what we think about in terms of the Western world, in contrast to the regions of Mesopotamia as well as Egypt. Let's talk a little bit about some of these examples in the context of looking at these fresco lilies from Akrotiri, and specifically the lily frescoes from Akrotiri, also known as spring frescoes. Now, these were located in the west walls in the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini. What we know about these is it's really interesting to sort of think about the ideas of what a landscape is, or in the context of visual analysis. How do we analyze these sort of images in terms of looking at these early frescoes on the walls of these sort of wonderful sort of sceneries of nature, but also sort of defining exactly what are frescoes specifically, right? So fresco is a mural painting technique that involves painting with water-based paint directly onto wet plaster so that the paint becomes an integral part of the plaster itself. So it sort of meshes and molds it together to become a sort of surface that artists can actually use. What's interesting about this slide here, specifically the lily frescoes from Akrotiri, is sort of recognizing in terms of interpreting three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, right? We talked a little bit about linear perspective as well as atmospheric perspective a little bit earlier last week, but it's also interesting to sort of see what sort of primary colors we actually start to see in the fresco here. What are our three primary colors? Red, blue, and yellow, right? Those are the three primary colors that cannot be mixed or created in order to create that color. Obviously, through archaeological excavation as well as sort of artistical analysis, they've been sort of filled in with some of these sort of cracks and damages over the years and decades, but also sort of you can see here, even the boxing male nudes and this fresco here has sort of been restored by sort of historical analysis, but also sort of seeing how in which these forms would have actually looked like in terms of antiquity. Let's talk a little bit about the Palace of Knossos, where sort of was the residence of King Minos himself, which was sort of one of the main rulers in the sort of Minoan culture, which is now obviously located in the island of Crete. And you also have to keep in mind this is around sort of 2000 BCE to 1580 BCE, which was sort of discovered by a British archaeologist, Sir Arthur John Evans. Excavation on the site began around 1899, where the sort of thinking about the engineering, but also the architectural wonders of this palace were sort of either designed or also sort of recreated by the great architect Daedalus, which was sort of according to Greek mythology. What we know about this site is obviously sort of the myths and mythology behind the sort of the story of the Minotaur, but also sort of what happened with sort of his reign and his campaign of King Minos himself, as well as his sort of daughter Ariadne. And we'll start to see that a little bit later in this lecture itself. But these are also sort of reconstructions and sort of painted solid pillars and columns that were sort of used for the general public to actually see and visit these site-specific locations on the modern day island of Crete. Here are some sort of illustrations or sort of renderings of what the palace actually would have looked like, but also sort of from an aerial perspective, you can kind of see where the throne, central court, the west wing, the east wing, the royal road, but also south entrance to the palace itself. For more context, you can also see here, would have been the throne room, flanked by two large griffins that are sort of pointing directly parallel to the throne where King Minos would have sat. But obviously in the bottom image here, you can kind of also see where the sort of building structure foundation would have had the stepping stones to kind of build upon those the palaces itself. Now, moving on, we can also sort of see, again, these are sort of depictions of one of the first water and plumbing systems implemented into the city, which was sort of created in the Palace of Knossos. But this also gives us a sort of recognition, but also a realization of of actual plumbing systems that we still actually even use today. We almost have to sort of thank the Minoan civilization that were sort of really well engineered, but also sort of thought about the hot climate in the island of Crete today, but also in sort of modern day Santorini, of looking at sort of the region itself in terms of extremely hot climates throughout the year, which is really interesting. But obviously, a lot of the citizens in Minoan civilizations would either sort of be in the nude, but also sort of being sort of well aware of the sort of bringing in fresh water from the region, from the rivers and valleys, but also sort of for drinking, but also sanitation purposes. Early frescoes of bull leaping were sort of documented in the walls of the Palace of Canassus, but also sort of reconstructed for what we can see here of a sort of, again, athletic sport where usually male nudes would actually sort of leap over these sort of large animal bulls as a sort of sign of strength, but also sort of controlling nature itself in terms of power. This was a sort of common sport in terms of what we now look at in terms of public athletic sports, but also sort of the Olympics, and specifically in Greek culture, which we'll kind of sort of look at. These illustrations are sort of early examples of bull sports from archaeological restorations from 7-panel frescoes, which is sort of quite interesting to sort of see. Stylistically, they're really sort of simplified, right? They're not sort of idealized, what we think about now in terms of sort of representing the human body. They're more sort of flat, but also sort of give us that sort of illustration of what they actually would have looked like in terms of their natural forms, right? Part of this is recognizing the differences between how we look at the history of Minoan civilization, but also sort of who actually ran and sort of were governed in terms of either deities, gods or goddesses, or political leaders, religious leaders. We really have really little record of what we now can sort of analyze, but also sort of learn from in terms of the Minoan civilization. This example here of the snake goddess, who sort of indicates a long-standing connection between women, nature, and snakes, gives us an example of sort of really no evidence of a male ruler in Minoan art, only female goddesses, which is quite interesting, right? And a part of this is recognizing, sort of looking at how certain male rulers from either Egyptian art, but also sort of even in relationship to Mesopotamia, is sort of thinking about how women became a sort of key, vital, crucial aspect in Minoan culture, which is quite interesting, right? This is long-standing history of what we now know in terms of the Western world from the beginning of time, but also sort of beginning of civilizations from certain parts in the Middle East, but also even beyond, that we had very little record of female rulers or female deities that were sort of leading their cultures during these times. We have some record from like Hatshep, the great pharaoh, or sort of the goddess that we now look at today. It's Hatshepsut herself in Egypt, but also sort of the wife of Akhenaten, Nefertiti herself. This goes also sort of going back to the story, and according to legend, King Minos refused to sacrifice a bull to Zeus, who punished him by making his wife fall in love with a bull, who lived in the heart of the labyrinth created by the great architect Daedalus. And again, these are sort of recreations of looking at the story, but also sort of they can kind of get an idea of sort of this large maze-like labyrinth that, again, that was sort of imprisoned by the Minotaur, but also sort of gives the story what happened. But according to legend, the Minotaur demanded the sacrifice of 7 young Greeks. Ariadne, which was actually the daughter of King Minos, fell in love with the great Greek soldier Theseus, and she gave him a ball of thread to find his way back to the labyrinth, to also eventually would slay and sort of kill the Minotaur. And a part of this is sort of thinking about these are sort of legends and stories and mythologies based off of Minoan as well as Greek tales, right? We can kind of see a really interesting relationship between recognizing through mythologies, but also sort of seeing the narrative aspect sort of play out. And we'll constantly see this theme actually even being presented later throughout the Renaissance as well. Here are some, again, more examples of sort of illustrations, but also sort of Greek vase paintings of the killing of the Minotaur, which is sort of probably a metaphor for sort of the eventual defeat of the Minoans by the Bronze Age around 1400 BCE. Theseus and the Minotaur sort of, again, gives this idea of looking at how Theseus is sort of stabbing the Minotaur directly into his body, but also similarly, we can kind of see in the ways of looking at even contemporary art, but also sort of at the beginning of modernism, where you have again renditions repeated again of Pablo Picasso's rendition of sort of similar narrative that are going on right now. It was sort of Minotaur gracing a sleeping woman, done in 1933. This is dry point etching that he sort of created, which is quite interesting to sort of see. It's remarkable to see again through these motifs, through the narrative aspect, through the story behind the Minotaur of what happened to him, but also his eventual death by the Greek soldier Theseus. It's interesting to sort of see what happens a little bit later on when we kind of see through Greek art of how artistically things have become much more different. Now, what we now looking at it today from the island of Santorini, which obviously is from satellite images from of how the island of Thera would have looked like, many thousands of years ago, it would have actually had a lot more land mass from the sort of, again, volcanic eruption and a tsunami wave that sort of destroyed and sort of wiped out the whole civilization around 1627 BCE, which is really, again, quite fortunate. But we can see through scientific analysis through this process of how the island would have looked like in terms of sort of, again, the geography, but also sort of seeing how through ecological sort of scientific perspectives, we can kind of see what was actually would have been buried or sort of underneath the water of the ocean itself. Now moving on to Greek art. And this is really important because, again, this is sort of recognizing how we see the differences, but also sort of how we compare between Greek and Minoan art. Now, ancient Greek art spans a period between 900 and 30 BCE and is divided mainly into four periods. There are sort of more periods we'll kind of go over a little bit later on, but these are the major four: geometric, archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. This is also the birthplace of democracy, playwrights, Western philosophy, which are examples which may include Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Euclid. Throughout that period, artists worked with a wide variety of materials, including bronze and stone for sculptures, terracotta for vases and figurations, various pigments for paintings, and gold, silver, and bronze for, again, coinage. This is really something we'll kind of come back to in terms of the idea of coinage and what that is. But through this, we can kind of sort of see specific time periods that we can kind of see the evolution of Greek art and how it sort of flourished a little bit later on. Now, geometric period really sort of took off right after Minoan art sort of ended around the sort of same region of the Mediterranean and near the Aegean Sea, but also sort of was around 1100 to 800 BC or BCE, excuse me. Archaic sort of came right after, which is around 750 to 500 BC. The classical period also sort of known, which was known sort of as the early classic or late classical period, which was around 510 to 323 BC, and then 323 to 460, 146, excuse me, BCE was sort of the end of what we now look at in terms of the early Hellenistic to late Hellenistic art. Moving towards this, we can kind of see, and this might be a sort of question on the exam of sort of what were the four Greek time periods. Let's look at an example from the early geometric period. Now, this terracotta crater is a wonderful example, and this kind of gives us this sort of idea of through geometric shapes and forms, what can we recognize, right? This was sort of created of what we now sort of can think about in terms of 700 to 735 BCE, directly made from a solid, sort of a hollow piece of terracotta, which was always, again, a ceramic material, but also was fired and glazed. This is now located in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, located in New York City. But sort of thinking about the question, what was the actual purpose of this object used for, in terms of it would have been used for a grave marker, funeral, sort of monument, but also sort of gives us an idea of the function, but also the purpose of this spot, actual face itself. Now, the crater gives us sort of illustrations of geometric forms on the top register here, and towards the bottom, this looks like a funerary sort of, again, this sort of commencement that is actually happening from either sort of some individual's funeral, but also sort of it could be a ruler or actual a military leader that was actually either sort of, again, mourning their loss, but also sort of during this funerary ceremony. But on the bottom here, we also sort of see individuals that are sort of in chariots, but also sort of laid down, gives us in terms of the warriors with their shields, horses that have sort of 6 individual legs, but also gives us a sort of idea of a narrative. Maybe a story would have been sort of linked directly to the figure that was actually either buried or also sort of memorialized in this sort of object. Part of this is recognizing what comes after, but also sort of seeing how in which we can kind of see the differences between the evolution of forms, specifically in the human form, right? The sort of the male or the female nudes. Now, the Greeks were fascinated with the human body, right? This Koros is a great example of this, and this is in the period of what we now know in terms of the archaic, which is a sort of solid piece of marble. This is located in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, but the sort of Greek Koros means youth, boy, specifically the noble rank, right? Part of this is recognizing how he's physically standing in terms of his pose, right? We can kind of see this broad shoulders, but also sort of encompassing that he's sort of walking towards us in terms of the dead giveaway of his feet, right? We have this sort of illustration of these braids that are kind of really sort of beautifully carved directly from the marble, but also in a very sort of stylized rendition of this male nude, right? Notice this gesture of his hands. Where is his hands sort of parallel to his hips, right? And same thing forward in terms of his upper body towards his lower body. It's very, very sort of stylized, right? We rarely kind of see his muscles, his bones, but also we can kind of see it in his knees, but also in his feet, but also some of the features of his face. But we see this collar around his neck, but also sort of this very elaborate sort of decorative aspect of his hair that kind of gives us this idea that it was a sort of, again, youthful, but also sort of young male individual. Now let's look at another example from the great potter, but also the great artist Ezekiel, specifically his rendition and story between the two sort of Greek soldiers, Ajax and Achilles, playing a game together as both soldiers. Again, this was a period during the Archaic period, which took sort of in around 540 to 530 BCE, carved directly with using terracotta. And this is roughly about 24 inches high. And specifically, this was featured in Homer's Iliad as an example of sort of, again, black figure paintings. Now, one thing to remember is also sort of seeing not only the narrative aspect behind this, but also sort of the differences between black figure vase paintings, which were directly carved into in relationship or comparison to red figure vase paintings, which were painted directly on ceramic. Images was always included everyday life of Greek mythology, but what's really interesting, we can kind of see the story between Achilles, who's sort of articulated here on the left, saying the word for four, tesserai in Greek, and then Ajax saying the word for three, tri. And what's really interesting is sort of seeing the relationship between both soldiers together, but also sort of even within the armor that Achilles is wearing, always sort of being cautious and aware that it could be, a fight or a war or sort of any momentary sort of scene or sort of event that can happen. That's why he always sort of is guarded himself with his armor, which is sort of what he's known for, but also sort of his sort of undefeated champion for a Greek a really well-known Greek soldier. In relationship to his friend Ajax is sort of much more relaxed, right? His body is much more sort of subtle. You can kind of see here his armor is sort of resting on the sort of right-hand side. This gives us sort of, again, the human aspect between both soldiers as sort of allies together as brotherhood. But throughout this sort of mythology, through Homer's Iliad, it gives us the sort of story between both of them almost having a sort of, again, human interaction with each other. Let's look at another example where, again, artists specifically were using other materials and more specifically bronze sculptures. This specific work of art would have been either sort of, again, Zeus, who is, or could have been either Poseidon himself, but also sort of could be sort of striking directly with it, either his bolt of lightning or sort of Poseidon's trident from the early classical period around 460 BCE. This is a pretty large sculpture, it's around 7 feet or 2.1 meters high. This is located in the archaeological museums in Athens, Greece. And what is being represented, it gives us this idea of sort of, again, the male nude, but also sort of this almost musculature of the human body, right? It's more active. And this is in the beginning of the early classical period, because if we can kind of see here, if we go back to the early Koros sculpture, this gives us an idea of an early archaic in relationship to sort of the beginning of the early classical period, which is much more lifelike, much more representational, right? From this, we can kind of understand, but also realize how the artists and artisans during this time period of the early classical period in Greece were actually sort of really focusing but analyzing through observation and really wanted to sort of honing their skill, their technique towards the body of a male nude. Uh, During this process, around the sort of late period of the late classical period, we can kind of see these sort of, again, techniques that artisans were using during this time, and specifically showcasing their fascination of the body itself. Now, contrapposto, which is sort of an Italian term meaning sort of the counterpose, in which a figure stands with their entire body weight supported over one straight leg and lets their arms fall in the opposite directions to create a sort of natural seeming twist in the torso. From this, you can kind of see here, this weight of the body is sort of given in this sort of leg, and the other leg is much more relaxed, right? But through visual analysis, we can kind of see this sort of angle, this diagonal of the hips towards the upper bodies of the shoulders, gives this sort of, again, really interesting perspective, but also sort of almost, again, counterbalance or counterpose from one portion of the body to the other, right? This is what we can kind of see, but also analyze. The more and more you sort of stand on 1 foot or actually 2 feet at a time, generally your body actually gets tired and sort of either rotates or but also sort of shifts your leg from one side to the other, right? From this, that the Greeks were fascinated with understanding how people would either stand, but also sort of pose in terms of their works of art. And even we can actually still sort of use this to even till today, right? The sort of the normalcy of sort of holding one side of the weight of your leg, holding your body, but also sort of shifting it to the other side. You kind of have that tendency to do that, which is really interesting. From this, we can also analyze, but also sort of see the Parthenon temple, which was sort of, again, demonstrating in the hills of the Acropolis of Athens, which is sort of dedicated to the goddess Athena, the Greek goddess Athena, is a great example of Greek architecture. Now, you have to also remember their temples, but also their places of worship were actually, used as sort of the beliefs from multiple gods, so sort of the pantheon of the, again, Greek mythologies in terms of their sort of deities. So we have, the majority of them as sort of, again, not a monotheistic religion, but also polytheistic religion, which has sort of many gods, right? Which was in the style of what we now look at in terms of, again, classical period, located in Athens, obviously using sort of multiple types of marble, but also sort of constructing. The construction actually started around 447 BC and completed around 432 BCE. Through this, citizens would actually walk up towards the west end of the Acropolis, coming up towards the actual building itself. And the story behind this is sort of giving us the narrative between both gods, Poseidon and then Athena themselves, sort of vying over the Athenian citizens in Greece. And obviously, eventually, Athena won. Poseidon, who strikes his trident towards the sea, towards the bottom of the Acropolis, and actually, has fresh salt water coming out of the ocean for his citizens as a gift to the Athenians, where Athena actually also plants an olive tree, showing the sort of the value, but also prosperity of nature, but also sort of for agriculture, right? Again, eventually the Athenians vote, and they'll actually have Athena become the great patron of their sort of capital city. From this, we can kind of see an aerial perspective of the floor plan with both Doric and Ionic columns, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but also sort of in this sort of pediment, metaphyses, and friezes here, we can kind of see illustrations that are depicting the story of what actually is going on in the structure itself. From this, we see the contrastings between, but also sort of, again, images that are coming from the birth of Athena, but also sort of the contest between both Athena and Poseidon on the west pediment of the Parthenon, the Acropolis in the sort of high classical period, which again, you can kind of see illustrations of Poseidon and his warriors and chariots and sort of soldiers in relationship to Athena, as well as her sort of soldiers and warriors. On the opposite side, on the west side of the pediment, we see sort of the birthplace of Athena. Again, Athena was sort of born directly as sort of a crack from Zeus's head, miraculously, and full-grown adult, was sort of, again, presented to the pantheon gods. But from this, we can kind of see what happens in the beginning from the west, to coming in from the entrance of the west pediment to the west end of the actual structure, coming all the way around to the east side, where you can kind of see, again, the birthplace of Athena herself. Might be a question on the exam, keep that in mind. Now let's talk a little bit about what's located on the east side of the pediment that gives us an example of the sort of the reaction of what happens during the birth of Athena herself. but also sort of in terms of the large pantheon of gods and goddesses on Mount Olympus. Now, if we're reading the pediment from left to right, we can see the god Helios, who's sort of rising and sort of, again, pulling the sun from the left side and sort of giving us a sort of, again, time period of when actually Athena was born, which was at sunrise. And sort of with his chariot kind of coming across from the left all the way up to the right side. And next to him, we have this sort of relaxed figure. And a lot of art historians are even having this conversation, whether if it's representing him as God, as the Greek god Dionysus, who sort of, again, is represented with wine, with sort of, again, really relaxation, but also he's sort of lounging in this sort of position of this male nude. And right next to him, we also sort of see these female figures here who are sort of adorned in drapery and fabric. But this is also sort of, again, looking at the Phidian style, which is sort of, again, the technique that the artist, but also sort of the well-known architect and artist Phidian himself was sort of known for, which were sort of, again, presented in these pediments and friezes, triglyphs, and metopes on the Acropolis in Athens. But in the center of this actual temple to the goddess Athena, we would have had this large, really interesting, a huge sculpture of the goddess Athena being presented to the Athenian citizens. Obviously, this is now, the original would have been actually adorned with gold and ivory, which was obviously then later melted down and destroyed for sort of, again, for other purposes. But this was actually now a Roman copy that was, again, still located in the Archaeological Museum in Athens. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the sort of traditional Greek orders and specifically relating them to the top of their capitals or the top of the columns. Now, the Doric capital of the Parthenon located in Athens is one of the simplest of the orders, characterized by short, organized, heavy columns with plain, round capitals for the tops, and no base, channeled with 20 flutes. The Ionic capital from the Queen Elizabeth II's Great Court of the British Museum, which is located in London, is sort of, it is distinguished by slender fluted pillars with a large base and two opposed scrolls to the top of the capital channeled with 24 flutes. Corinthian capitals of a column from the Pantheon located in Rome is one of the most sort of elaborate of the Greek orders, characterized by a slender fluted column, having an ornate capital decorated with 2 rows of acanthus leaves and 4 scrolls. Part of looking at the most sort of highly decorative column capitals we can kind of see here. Now, there are 2 other sort of orders that are also included, which is Tuscan and Composite, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get into Roman art, and specifically a little bit later on. But these are some of the Greek traditional orders. This might be a question on the exam, FYI. Now, let's look at another great example of the Nike of Samothrace, which is a sort of, again, winged victory sculpture. This is a part of what we now see as the Hellenistic period in Greek art. What's really remarkable about this sculpture is that sort of, again, when it was discovered on the island of Samothrace, located north of the Aegean Sea, this actually would have been installed directly at the tip of a large naval ship, so sort of guiding the soldiers of the Greek armies or the Greek naval army to kind of be presenting and forcefully sort of, again, cruising along the sort of the region of the Mediterranean and beyond to kind of guide them to victory as a sort of symbol of victory, showcased from Nike of Samothrace, kind of giving her that name. What's really interesting in characteristics associated with the Hellenistic is sort of, again, enigmatic, exaggerated, dramatic, kind of over the top. This gives us an almost sort of, again, drama of the flesh, moving the body in 3-dimensional space, right? Because of this, this gives us a sort of representation of the body itself moving in the physical world, meaning kind of moving across the sort of Aegean Sea, kind of having waves and waves of sort of air and sort of, again, the climate itself being really warm, kind of brushing across her entire body, kind of around this sort of wonderful use of drapery, all carved on a single piece of marble, which is pretty fantastic. Another great example of this is sort of early Hellenistic work is sort of the Laocoon and his sons, which is, again, a period in the Hellenistic period that we can kind of see. This is also actually carved directly from marble itself. It's located in the Vatican Museum City, in the Vatican City. But the story behind Laocoon, who was a sort of Trojan priest who knew that the Trojan horse that arrived on the outside of the city of Troy from the Greeks, their enemies, was a trick in trying to warn the city. What happened after him? He was sort of punished. And again, the gods of Mount Olympus sort of sent serpents to actually devour his sons right in front of him. And you can kind of see here this sort of, again, really exaggerated sort of drama of sort of Lê Quan himself in the center, almost trying to protect and save his two sons who are about to be devoured by these large serpents. This last slide in context to sort of see, but what we can learn from mosaics, and specifically this Alexander mosaic, which was sort of created during the Hellenistic period around 100 BCE. This is roughly large, around 8, I would say 9 to about almost 16 feet large. This scene is sort of depicting the great Greek general Alexander, who's also being represented here in this chariot, facing his enemy, the great Persian ruler Darius himself. And it is this momentary sort of scene that almost gives us this drama between both sort of civilizations sort of colliding within each other in terms of their wars, but also sort of the plea of forgiveness that, again, eventually Darius is almost pleading for his soldiers and himself to the great Greek general Alexander. And because of this, through history, we know that Alexander was eventually known for his compassion, which was really, really sort of fortunate for Darius's sort of reign, but eventually he was sort of executed after his sort of conquest, which was really unfortunate. But it's this sort of scene that gives us a sort of really interesting dynamism between the almost chariot that's about to turn around this sort of three-dimensional space and kind of wrap around, but also turn in an opposite direction, running away from the Greek soldiers, but also from directly Alexander's chariot here, but it's also sort of part of it's obviously missing. But we see this sort of focus, this sort of dedication, this intensity from the expression of Alexander, who's facing directly towards his enemy, which are the Persians, and directly sort of in the face of death to Darius and his soldiers. What's really interesting is you can kind of see here, I don't know if you can kind of see it on the slide, but this sort of reflection between the soldier who's sort of guarding himself with a shield, but also you can see his reflection on his sort of surface of the shield, to kind of knowing that this is the moment that he's about to die. And what I love about this sort of work of art is really showcasing this intensity, but also the intimacy between both generals from opposing sides in this mosaic, which is pretty remarkable. Later throughout this week, we'll kind of dive into a little bit more about Roman art, but also sort of seeing the differences between Greek and Roman art in relationship to their mosaics, their paintings, their vase paintings, their sculptures, but also as well as their architecture. I will see everybody on Wednesday. Have a wonderful rest of the week.